Move along, some of us actually have places to be. The woman's voice cut through the quiet hum of the pharmacy like a blade. Sharp, impatient. The kind of voice that had never once waited for anything in its life. Tunda didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the pharmacist behind the counter, a young woman named Adira Mensah, 29 years old, third shift, 9 hours into a 12-hour stretch, and he patted his coat pockets one more time. Left, right, inside breast pocket. Nothing. "I'm so sorry," he said softly, not to the woman behind him, but to Adira. "I must have left my wallet in the car. The parking. I walked quite far, and I think I put it in the glove box. I'm sorry." Adira looked at him. Really looked at him. He was older, maybe late 50s, in a worn canvas jacket the color of dried grass. His shoes were clean but old. He was holding a small white paper bag. One prescription, already counted, and his hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly. Not from nerves. From something else. Behind him, a woman in a camel-colored coat huffed loud enough for the whole store to hear. Her name was Renata. She had a loyalty rewards card, a blowout that probably cost more than Adira's rent, and absolutely no interest in whatever was unfolding at counter 3. "Can you hold it for me?" Tunda asked. "I'll go back to the car." Adira looked at prescription label. Blood pressure medication, 30-day supply, $42.17. She looked at the clock. It was 11:40 at night. She thought about her son Kofi, asleep at her mother's house across town, because she couldn't afford after-school care on night shift wages. She thought about the transfer she had scheduled for Friday, the one that would clear her account down to less than $30 until next payday. She thought about the granola bar she'd eaten at 7 o'clock that was supposed to hold her until the end of her shift, and then she reached under the counter, picked up her purse, and pulled out 2 20s. "Please," she said, "don't worry about it." Tunda stared at her. "Miss, I can't." "Please," she said again, and she smiled at him. Not the customer service smile she'd been trained to give. The real one. "You need it tonight, not tomorrow." The woman in the camel coat made a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "Oh, come on. This is theater. He can just go to his car." Adira didn't respond to that. She processed the transaction, counted back his change from her own money, slid the prescription across the counter in a small white bag, and said, "Have a good night, sir. Please take care of yourself." Tunda stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. His jaw worked like he was trying to find words that didn't exist in any language he knew. Finally, he just nodded once. Deep, deliberate, the kind of nod that means something, and walked toward the door. Renata stepped up to the counter with her credit card already out, shaking her head. "They really let anyone work nights." Adira said nothing. She scanned the items. She said the total. She said, "Have a good night." The words came out of her mouth automatically, while the rest of her stood somewhere quieter, thinking about $42.17 and whether she'd made the right call. She had. She just didn't know yet exactly how right. Let me tell you something about Adira Mensah before we go any further, because she is not the kind of woman who shows up in stories like this as a symbol. She is a person, specific, tired, determined in the way that only people who have had to be can understand. She grew up in Scarborough, the daughter of Ghanaian parents who came to Canada in the 90s with 4 suitcases and a ferocious belief that education was the only wall that mattered. Her father, Emmanuel, drove a cab for 11 years before he got his nursing credentials recognized. Her mother, Grace, cleaned offices on the night shift while her kids slept, then came home and made breakfast before school, so her children never once felt the weight of what she carried. Adira watched all of it. She absorbed it. She became, in many ways, the sum of both of them. Her father's quiet steadiness, her mother's refusal to let hardship touch the people she loved. She'd done 2 years of pharmacy technician training at Centennial College, graduated near the top of her class, and taken the night shift at Medicare Plus on Dan 4th because it paid a slightly higher differential and she needed every dollar. She was 29. She had a 6-year-old son named Kofi who liked dinosaurs and hated green pepper, and could recite every country in Africa from memory because Adira had made it a game between them. She was not looking for rescue. She was not praying for a miracle. She was doing what her mother and father had always done, showing up, doing the work, and treating people with the same decency she hoped the world would eventually return. She paid $42.17 for a stranger's blood pressure medication on a Tuesday night in November, and then she went back to restocking cough suppressants behind the counter and tried not to think about Friday's bank transfer. The man's name was Tunde Adeyemi Clark, 56 years old. Born in Lagos, raised partly in London, settled in Toronto in 2001 with a consulting firm he'd co-founded with 2 university friends and built, over the following 20 years, into one of the largest independent infrastructure investment firms in the country. He had a house in Rosedale. He had an apartment in London he used twice a year. He had a driver named Seek, short for Sikiru, who had been with him for 14 years and who knew, without being told, when to speak and when to simply drive. He had also genuinely left his wallet in the glove box. He hadn't been testing anyone. He hadn't been running an experiment on human nature. He'd been rushing because his appointment had run late, because he hadn't eaten since noon, because the pharmacist at his usual location had told him the prescription would take another day, and because the medication wasn't optional. His doctor had been very clear about that. He'd grabbed the prescription slip, jogged to his car, walked the 3 blocks to Medicare Plus without thinking, and only patted his pockets at counter 3. He walked to the car in the November cold, thinking about the look on that young woman's face. Not pity, not performance. She had not wanted anything from him. She had simply seen a person standing in front of her without enough, and she had given what she had. At 11:40 on a Tuesday, on a pharmacist's wage, with hands that smelled faintly of hand sanitizer, and a shift that wasn't even halfway done. He sat in the back of the car for a moment. "Seek," he said. "Sir, the woman at counter 3, can you find out who she is?" Seek looked at him in the rearview mirror. This was not an unusual request. Tunde had a way of meeting people, ordinary, unremarkable encounters, that stayed with him. He'd hired 3 people over the years because of conversations in lobbies or elevators or grocery store lines. He had a nose for something. Character. The real kind, not the performed kind. "I'll see what I can find," Seek said. "Don't make it strange," Tunde said. "Just find out if she's all right." What Seek found over the next 4 days was this: Adira Mensa, 29, pharmacy technician, night shift, Medicare Plus on Dan 4th. Single mother. One's son, Kofi, 6, in grade 1 at Nelson Mandela Public School. Her parents lived in Scarborough. Her mother helped with childcare on night shifts, but was dealing with her own health issues. A hip replacement scheduled for February. Adira was supporting herself, contributing to her parents' household, and saving, slowly, painfully, for the deposit on a pharmacy technician upgrading program at George Brown that would let her move into a supervisory role and off the night shift permanently. She had no criminal record. She had a 4.8 rating on the pharmacy's internal customer review system. She had, according to a colleague Seek, spoke to briefly while picking up a prescription of his own, once stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift to help an elderly Somali woman navigate a complicated insurance issue that the system kept rejecting without billing any overtime, simply because the woman had started crying. Seek brought all of this back to Tunde in a single typed page. Tunde read it twice, Then he folded it in half and set it on his desk. Her mother's hip, he said. When is the surgery? February 14th, Seek said. She'll need someone to cover her childcare for at least 2 weeks while recovery happens. The system they've built, it works, but it's fragile. It's always fragile, Tunde said quietly. That's the part that people on the outside never see, how fragile it is. He looked out the window for a long moment. Then he said, set up a meeting at the pharmacy. Find a way to do it naturally. Don't make it an ambush. I want to return the $42, and I want to talk to her. Seek allowed himself a very small smile. Yes, sir. Tunde came back the following Thursday, just after Adira's shift started at 10. He came alone this time without Seek, and he wore the same canvas jacket. He brought his wallet. He walked to counter 3 and waited until she looked up. When she saw him, she blinked. Then a careful look moved across her face, a checking look, the kind of look that people who've been caught off guard have learned to use while they decide whether to be warm or guarded. Hi, he said. I came back. I see that. I brought your money. He placed 2 20s on the counter. With interest, he added a third. That's too much, she said immediately. It's $60, he said, and it's not enough. She looked at the money. She looked at him. You didn't have to come back at all. I know. A pause. I also, he said carefully, wanted to ask you something, if that's all right. Depends on the question. He almost smiled. Fair enough. Why did you do it? I'm not asking to flatter you. I genuinely want to understand. You didn't know me. You had no reason. Adira was quiet for a moment. She straightened a row of prescription bags that didn't need straightening. My dad used to say, she said finally, that you can tell everything about a person's by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them. I've thought about that since I was a kid. She shrugged. One shoulder, easy. You needed medication that night. Not tomorrow. I had the money. It wasn't complicated. Tunde stood very still. You know, he said quietly, I have had people work for me for 20 years, people I've paid very well. And I have never once heard something that simple said with that much certainty. She looked at him more carefully now. What do you do? Infrastructure investment, he said. Which sounds complicated, but is mostly just deciding where to put resources so things don't fall apart. She picked up the 3 20s and set 2 of them aside, keeping just the 42 she'd originally paid. She'd counted out the cents from her break coins. This is yours, she said, sliding the extra 20 back across the counter. I'm not taking interest on a favor. The woman 3 customers behind him, a middle-aged woman in an expensive parka, leaned over to her companion and whispered something. The companion nodded. Someone else in the line was pretending to look at their phone but wasn't. The whole counter had gone very still. Tunde picked up the 20. He nodded. Can I ask you one more thing? You can ask. What are you working toward, not? I'm not asking to be condescending. I mean, what's the next step you're trying to reach? She studied him for a long moment. Then, perhaps because he'd asked without flinching and without pity, she told him. The George Brown program, the supervisory role. Getting off nights before Kofi started needing her present in the evenings. The February situation with her mother and the 2-week gap she hadn't fully solved yet. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer anything. He just listened. Thank you, he said when it's finished, for telling me that, and for the medication. He picked up the 20, tucked it in his jacket. I hope everything works out with February. He walked out. She stood at counter 3 for a moment, slightly unsettled, and then turned back to the line. 3 days later, she got a call from the George Brown College admissions office. Someone had paid her application fee and the first semester deposit in full, anonymously. The enrollment officer said only that it had come with a note asking the college to notify Adira directly, and that it was non-refundable regardless of her decision, so she should take her time. She sat in the break room for a long time after that call. She didn't know for certain it was him. She told herself she didn't know. She turned it over and over. The timing, the questions he'd asked, the way he had listened, and then she folded it away and told herself to get back to work. A week after that, a woman from a private family support service called her mother's house. The woman explained that a home recovery care package had been arranged for Grace Mensa, following her February hip replacement. 2 weeks of daily visits, assistance with meals and mobility, completely covered. The family had been referred by an anonymous donor. Grace called Adira immediately. "Adira, who is this man?" "I don't know, Mama. You do know." A long pause. "I think I know," Adira said. "If you're waiting for the part where Renata, the woman in the camel coat, faces consequences, don't worry. We're getting there." Renata Alcott Winslow worked as a senior account manager at Beaumont Capital, a mid-sized investment firm in the financial district. She had been at Beaumont for 11 years. She was good at her job in the specific way that people who are good at managing up and performing competence tend to be good. All surface, solid delivery, carefully constructed reputation. 2 weeks after the pharmacy, Tunde Adeyemi Clark's firm, Clark Adeyemi Infrastructure Partners, entered early discussions with Beaumont Capital about a potential co-investment in a transit infrastructure project in the GTA. It was the kind of deal that doesn't come along often, the kind that reshapes careers. Beaumont's managing director, a careful man named Gordon, assigned Renata to the preliminary meetings. She walked into the boardroom at Clark Adeyemi Partners on a Wednesday afternoon and found Tunde Adeyemi Clark sitting at the head of the table. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was wearing a suit now, not the canvas jacket. A very good suit, charcoal gray, the kind that signals nothing because it doesn't need to. There was a glass of water in front of him and a legal pad and a pen, and his hands were not trembling. She didn't place him immediately. Then, just as she was shaking his hand, it came back. The pharmacy, the man at the counter, the wallet. "Miss Alcott Winslow," he said pleasantly. "Please sit down." She sat. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Tunde was professional. He asked sharp, intelligent questions. He gave nothing away. At the end, he thanked the team for coming, said Clark Adeyemi would be in touch regarding next steps, and shook hands around the table. When he shook Renata's hand, he held it 1 beat longer than necessary. "Beaumont has a strong team," he said, and then, so quietly that only she could hear, "I hope the rest of your evening is more patient than your Tuesdays." She understood immediately. She smiled her professional smile, gathered her portfolio, and walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood there. The deal went to a different firm. Gordon was disappointed. He told Renata that the client had some concerns about cultural fit with the Beaumont team, and he couldn't get specifics. But Clark Adeyemi had been very clear. She never learned exactly which moment had cost them the contract. She suspected she already knew. Now, here is where some of you will ask, but was it fair? Was one overheard comment in a pharmacy, however unkind, enough to lose a deal? Perhaps not in a vacuum. But here is what Tund later told Seek, and what Seek told no one until much later. It wasn't the comment that decided him. It was the logic of the thing. If a person sees someone in need, a real person, standing right in front of them, with a real problem that has a small and obvious solution, and their first response is performance of inconvenience, Tunde had learned, after 56 years, that this tells you something you can't unknow. Not about their morality, about their judgment, about what they consider worth their attention. And in infrastructure investment, he had found attention is everything. Where you point, it says everything about what you'll build. He did not think of it as punishment. He thought of it as clarity. In late January, Tunde came back to the pharmacy one more time. Again, alone. Again, the same jacket. This time he brought a coffee, a medium from the Tim Hortons around the corner, because he had asked Seek what she drank, and Seek had, through methods he didn't explain, found out. And he set it on the counter. "This feels calculated," Adira said, looking at the cup. "It is," he said. "I was trying to bring something you'd actually want." "You called the college," she said. "It was not a question." "I redirected some resources," he said. "And my mother." February is a long time to have a fragile plan. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the fluorescent hum of the pharmacy. Somewhere in the back, the sound of the pill counter. The smell of hand sanitizer and recycled air. "Why?" she asked. And she meant the real question, not the surface one. He thought about it honestly. "Because," he said, "I have spent 20 years in rooms where decisions get made about where things go, resources, infrastructure, investment, and I have learned that the most important question isn't where the money is, it's where the care is. Because care is load-bearing. It holds things up that would otherwise fall." He paused. "You showed me where yours was. At 11:40 on a Tuesday night for $42.17. I just followed the line." She was quiet for a while. "You should know," she said finally, "that I'm not looking for someone to fix things." "I know," he said. "I'm not a project. I know that too." She looked at him. "Then what is this?" He considered the question carefully, the way she'd noticed he always did. "An introduction," he said. "That's all it has to be if you want." She called him 2 weeks later. Not about the George Brown program, not about her mother's recovery, both of which were going well, thank you, but because she had a question about infrastructure investment and whether what he'd said in the pharmacy was a real philosophy or something he'd said to sound interesting. He laughed, an actual laugh, not a polished one. "Both, probably. Tell me the real version." So he did. They talked for an hour and 17 minutes. She asked questions he hadn't been asked in years. Not because they were naive, but because they came from a completely different vantage point, from the bottom of the systems he spent his days analyzing, and they made him see things he had stopped looking at. He called her the following week. She called him the week after that. By spring, Kofi had met him twice. Once at a dinosaur exhibit at the ROM, where Tunde had stood patiently for 35 minutes, while Kofi explained the difference between a brachiosaurus and a diplodocus with the authority of a tenured professor. "He's very serious," Tunde said afterward. "He gets it from me," Adira said. "I know," Tunde said. "That's what I meant." They did not rush. They were both people who had learned, in different ways and from different directions, that the things worth having do not benefit from being hurried. Grace approved, with conditions she made extremely clear to Tunde personally at a Sunday dinner in Scarborough that he later described as the most rigorous interview of his professional life. Emmanuel shook his hand and said little, which Adira told him was the highest compliment available. There was no envelope produced in a parking lot. There was no dramatic reveal in a crowded store. There was just Tuesday becoming Thursday, Thursday becoming the weekend becoming something they started to count on, until one evening in October at a kitchen table in a house on Danforth that smelled like jollof and wood smoke, Tunde looked across at Adira and said something quiet, something real, something that made her set down her fork. Kofi was in the next room reciting countries. Outside, it was starting to snow, and the answer she gave him, later, after the snow had settled and Kofi had gone to sleep and the kitchen was quiet, was simply, yes. Not because of the college fees or the home care or the resources redirected or any of the things he'd done, but because he had asked about the next step she was trying to reach, and he had listened without flinching, and he had treated her, from the very first moment at counter 3, as someone who already knew what she was doing. That, her father had always said, is how you know. If this story found something in you, if you've ever been the person at counter 3, giving what you had even when it wasn't much, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, please share it. We'll see you in the next story.